Welcome, everyone. Today we have a
Hello?
wonderful guest, Haitham, also known
Okay.
as Haythumi.
You got
We
it?
are.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
perfect. Yeah, thank you guys for having me. It's good to see you
Man,
guys.
pleasure. I've seen your content on Instagram a lot. Man, I've been wanting to meet you for a long time, so it's really a pleasure to speak with you.
Oh, appreciate it. Thank you so much. I love what you guys are doing. So it's
Likewise.
good to be here. Thank you, Hayan, for inviting me.
Yo, my pleasure, and it's actually an honor, to talk to you. I appreciate that you're a busy guy. I see the activities that you do, and yeah. So just could you tell us like a bit about how you started content creation? Like, I think you're coming from Washington right now, DC.
Yes, yes, Washington, D.C. metro area. Yep, DMV.
Awesome, man. Yeah, yeah. So can you just introduce yourself to our listeners and what got you into content creation and like I found you on TikTok personally and I think you found me by also like I showed up on your feed and you just followed back and I think we've shared a live discussion a couple times.
Yeah,
But yeah, like I'm really like glad we get to actually have a long discussion today about Sham and about Palestine and Syria and
sure.
but yeah, please explain to us your roots, your name, where people can find you, how you got into content creation, and yeah.
Yeah. So, hello everyone. My name is Haitham. I'm a Palestinian American. I actually was born in Maryland, and then when I was young, I moved to Ramallah in the West Bank. So, back in Palestine to reconnect with my roots. But my family in Palestine, they're from Tulkarem, which is in the northern side of the West Bank. About 20 minutes from the beach, but can't go to the beach. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I was
that's
just looking
how
at
I
the
always
map. Yeah.
introduce it. So lived there throughout my elementary school, but I used to visit before I moved there, and I would visit after, my last time being May of 2023. And then I moved back to Maryland, and from that point, as someone who got into geography early on, got into like flags of the world early on through the Atlas, and not gonna lie, seeing government agencies for aid and all the help, and sometimes car dealerships that helped a little bit too. Sometimes car dealerships they'll put like the flag of the place.
Of which
Um,
place, like the country they're in?
G Germany, for because some people like the BMWs and the Mercedes, but some institutions like JICA. JICA is like one of the Japanese ones, so they do a lot of like the architectural restorations. So
And
they've
they
done
put
that for
their
a few sites, like in Jericho near the Dead Sea, for
okay,
some floor mosaics, which was pretty cool project.
interesting.
But that's kind of where I got into geography and maps, and technically in the world stage, not having your own state, you also get curious about other places around you,
Mm,
little disputed areas, places that are unrecognized, places that were on the map, not on the map anymore, or
right.
have become a bunch of little blocks.
Yeah.
So that was always really interesting. And I always appreciated the history in our region, in the Levant, and further Middle East, North Africa, Anatolia, and so much more. I began on TikTok in 2020 during the peak pandemic days.
Hmm.
I was really bored, but I didn't really know what type of content I wanted to do. I think I mainly joined around the time of the George Floyd protests.
Mm,
That was it was an interesting way to hear people's activism where you don't really outside of like a mainstream like CNN, Fox News in the US. It was a way to just hear and listen to different perspectives, but also people put in so much effort to do research on certain topics I didn't learn in American history class,
oh yeah.
Hmm.
or or maybe I did, but it was very like this much.
Mm,
Hmm.
They didn't really dive into like the philosophies or the theories or
right.
a lot of the depth that some of these activists have had.
Right.
Um,
Hmm.
and so from there, I continued trying to find what niche I had. And I remembered, I used to like flags a lot.
Hmm.
What if I talk about those?
I
And
remember, yeah, like your niche was niche things. That's
yeah,
what I
it was
remember
very
is like
niche.
it was your niche was things that not really like that get like looked over, and you don't know about, like Micronesia or something like that, like
Yeah,
stuff that no one knows about that is just
yeah, like
interesting, it's really
Palau
cool.
or Tonga, you know.
Hmm.
Shout out to the Pacific Island nations. They deserve a little bit more love.
For sure, for sure.
Um, yeah, so I think the first flag I went over was Afghanistan because originally I was going in alphabetical order by the UN.
Mm,
And then people were like, "Oh, can you do my flag or do my?" I'm like, "Oh, that's gonna be further down the line."
hmm.
And then I said, what if I just mix it up and go by what I see, what requests I see most?
Right.
So that was really fun. I learned a lot about also, the maps of the world, a little bit of history, because when you have different, as a Syrian yourself, different flag designs have different stories behind them, different chapters.
Yeah.
For the eight flags modern Syria has gone through.
Yeah, bro. Like I remember one of your like one video that popped up in my feed of yours was when you said like Syria was the most controversial flag that you've ever seen, like in your comments, even more than like Albania and even more than
Or
like
Iran,
or
maybe.
Yugoslavia or yeah, like so yeah, like and I remember like there was a lot of influencers at that time that are pro Assad, and you were one of the few who was like steadfastly like like the Syrian maybe you didn't like express like oh, Assad is like an evil person and you support the revolution, but you were like very like even-sided. You weren't like, oh, like the CIA tried to, it was like no, the Syrian
Yeah,
people like hated him and
because
stuff like that.
I guess for me, it's like living in Palestine. I never understood how do people in the West just willy-nilly just love a dictator,
Mm,
Yeah.
or make so many excuses for him because I I don't know where I grew up. I never heard any love towards the guy, so I was like, wait, do people like this guy or do they just
mm.
ignore? I mean,
It's
I don't like any
contrarianism.
Arab leaders,
Yeah.
frankly, but
And
like,
because of
what?
Palestine itself, because they notice how there's lies about Palestine being spread and they become aware of it, they suddenly think like, oh, because the Syrian like the media actually was kind of against Assad, they think, oh,
Yeah.
there must be a cover up, they must be hiding something, this must be a plan, and so they
Yeah.
develop this like contrarianism where if the West approved of the revolution, oh, it must be bad, or if
Yeah.
Israel approves of the revolution, it must be like a bad or whatever like that, and so they
Yeah.
try to create a binary that like is kind of made to divide us, in my opinion, and it
100%.
sadly it works a lot of the time it works.
Yeah.
Haitham, in Palestinian communities, what are you tending to see in regards to their thoughts on Syria? Do you find that most have been very optimistic recently? Are they more in the pro-Assad camp? What have you personally seen from the Palestinian community?
Yeah, so I feel like, it's always like a mixed bag, but in like from my own experience, or at least since this past December, I think that seeing like, we all thought like the Arab Spring was a failure. I mean, to be discussed again, maybe we'll see another 10 years, I don't know.
Hmm.
But you can't take away the intent to, the fight for it was a fight for freedom before anybody, regardless of whatever 15 million groups are there that, want to corrupt a movement. It's like it started out as a fight for freedom. These people have been oppressed for so long,
Hmm.
for decades under the same family, and it's like, where did our like empathy go
Hmm.
just to
Hmm.
score political points or political gotchas? I don't think that's very fair.
Yeah.
But I think after like Assad was overthrown and ran away to Moscow, right away, I think maybe 2 days later, we saw more in Palestine, specifically in the Jenin refugee camp. Revolts against the Palestinian Authority,
Yeah.
who has operated as a puppet by Israel, but also within their own selfish interest. It wasn't about freedom for Palestinians. It was about maintaining control of what I call the not territories, the Palestinian islands. You
Yeah.
Right.
know, for
Understands. Yeah.
example, I'm a Palestinian Authority citizen, but
Hmm.
I'm not a citizen of a state or a partially recognized state. I'm a citizen of a few cities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
of a few urban centers that get encroached upon by the Israelis and also get suppressed by the so-called authority that's on my passport.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you were talking about I like your most recent video on TikTok was about Mo, and I just finished watching like the second season. And he goes through he went to what was his town that he went to again?
Burin, it's outside of
Burin.
Nablus.
Okay,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah. And yeah, like so like what you're talking about, you're a citizen of several cities, and to get from one city to another, you're no like you're in areas that make you no longer a citizen too, and there's a lot of humiliation, and man, he portrays it really well.
Yeah.
And I think like yeah,
And
you're a fan of the show, you said, but like yeah, do you think like what parts specifically did it get right about the experience, and which parts stood out to you the most?
what parts in the show were not right?
Well, no, well, yeah. I mean, it did they miss anything, or was it mostly like accurate? And what parts stood out to you the most? Like, were the most harrowing to watch as a Palestinian that you like,
Yeah.
related to?
I think it was mostly accurate in the sense of this is life specifically in the West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Um, I I think maybe if I had to critique, it's not really much of a critique. I loved it, but
Yeah, it's very funny.
what some people might not realize is the division amongst different sets of Palestinians, in
Hmm.
that there's four or five categories of us. That one category they mainly talked about was Palestinians of the West Bank,
Mm-hmm.
which is a pretty big category. But even categories within Jerusalem or East Jerusalem, or those who are Israeli citizens who live
Mm-hmm.
in Haifa, Jaffa, the whole Galilee region. And then especially in the Gaza Strip, it's like you're all suffering,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah.
it's like you're in different tiers in a
Yeah.
sense.
I
So
think,
yeah, good.
if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Rashid Khalidi who famously described it as a pyramid of rights, right? Of course, at the top is Ashkenazi Jews, and then once you get through the Jewish ladder of Mizrahi and Sephardi, Ethiopian, you get to the Arab category, you got Palestinian citizens of Israel at the top of the ladder, you go all the way down and get to Gaza. And so I think it's
Wow,
like,
someone actually made a tier list.
yeah, Rashid Khalidi, I think he's at Columbia currently, or maybe he's
And
retired, but
And I'm
yeah.
sure he had like a lot of reasons to justify that, but I think like, hard is hard. Whatever someone is going through in Gaza, it's not any less hard than what someone's going through in West Bank, and what someone's going through in 48 territories is not any less hard than like someone's going through in West Bank or in Gaza. Like it's another way to divide us, I think, to put it on tiers. And I'm sure like yeah, please send me that link. I'd be curious to actually read it and stuff like that. But yeah, no, like everything that Palestinians are going through is horrible. And I think like I thought what you were saying when there's like different kinds of Palestinians, like I thought the way that he expressed like the different characters, like every squad got this character, that character, like his mom seems like really activist. She keeps up with the news. She's like very she's watching children suffer every day. She's like saying like trying to keep her kids reminded about it, and they like her and her daughter have this moment where she tells her like you need to stop, you're killing yourself, like it's very very hard to keep watching it and stuff, and she's like we owe it to them to watch. And then you have like Hamid or something, that the one that's like super pro America, and he's like really happy, and he has like a white wife and stuff.
Because he got the green card. Yeah,
Yeah, for sure. Like so you also got that kind of thing like among Palestinians in every area. There are people who still have their like diverse opinions, and they're against this or against that and pro this and pro that. It's all not a monolith, and I like how he, at
yeah,
least in that aspect, like the characters were not all like y-
Yeah.
you know I like how he tries to force a lot of like Jewish Palestinian interactions, like the coffee shop where like the Jew is playing with like the Palestinian cards or
yeah,
something. Those are kind of forced, I think, but I like how he tries to express the diversity in the discourse. It's not all like black and white and stuff like that.
I think it's important to point out that the divisions we are talking about within Palestinian society are a colonial implementation of Israel, right? At the end of the day, it's not something that Palestinians imposed upon themselves, it was imposed on them by Israel.
Mm,
Uh, and so it's not, yeah, you're right, it is something to divide Palestinians, but it's not something created by Palestinians.
of
So, I
course,
mean,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, at the end of the day. But I do want to talk a little more about your background, Haitham. So you mentioned in the beginning of the conversation you're from Tulkarem, correct?
Mhm.
So,
Yes.
and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the most famous images we get here in America of Tulkarem is it's right smack dab in the center of it is the division wall, is the apartheid wall dividing the West Bank and Israel.
Yeah.
Um, can you talk? I assume you were definitely alive in 2002, I think it was. It was during the second.
Yeah. So when I was living there, the wall was about 1 month old. Yeah.
Wow,
So I was around second grade when it was finished
crazy.
or began because it was a lot longer. We didn't know how long it was going to be.
Yep.
But it got long and tall. So
And what I mean, I've heard stories of like families themselves, like being on one side of the wall, others on the other side. Was your family one of those? I mean, I assume you had friends and family put on both sides of the
sure.
wall, but I would love to hear your experience.
Yeah. So one thing people might not realize with Tulkarem is, yes, it's on the edge of the West Bank. So if you look at pre-48, the sub-districts, so the Tulkarem district did touch the coast.
Hmm.
And so that's where the current Israeli settlement is known as Netanya.
Mm,
Hmm.
But it absorbed other towns that were ethnically cleansed. One is
mm,
called Khalid. That was now annexed into a neighborhood of Netanya.
Hmm.
So when I used to be able to go to the beach, we would use Netanya as the beach.
Hmm.
But by 2000, couldn't do that anymore. So one thing a lot of people might not realize with the wall is it doesn't necessarily separate Israelis from Palestinians. It's kind of like you said, it also separates Palestinians from other Palestinians.
Yeah.
And Tulkarem has one of those places. There is a town called Baqa, and Baqa, I believe in English you would spell it Baqa,
mm.
Baqa. So there's East Baqa and West Baqa, and they're both on the West Bank, but the wall cuts through the town. So
Wow.
it's kind of like a farm on one side, farmer on the other side. And yeah, it's a very strange predicament to be in because a lot of Tulkarem mainly compared to the other cities, we call our sibling cities like Nablus and Jenin.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, but we're a coastal city without a coast, and you lose that, and ideally without any barrier, it's 20 minutes away. Like we
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
see if
Yeah.
you stand on any roof in Tulkarem on a nice day, you can see the water.
Yeah.
We have the humidity,
Oh
um,
man.
but then you add that wall, and then there's another thing that's cut off, and this area was very agricultural. So a lot of people who, lived in Tulkarem after 48 left Tulkarem because they couldn't maintain any, like, a lot of land was lost.
Yeah.
So even if it became part of the West Bank and they didn't necessarily have to leave,
Yeah.
um, they couldn't sustain it. So they either went to maybe Nablus next door or Jordan.
Wow. And you're touching on something I think most people, at least my age, around the 20 to 25 age gap, don't understand. Before the Second Intifada, even if you were in the West Bank, you had a degree of freedom of movement to the coast. You could go to places what is now quote unquote Israel proper. For
Yes.
many in the West Bank, that's completely been taken away from them after the Second Intifada. Did you have that experience of being restricted, or I mean, if
Yes,
you were
yeah.
there, great, I would assume you have memories, but happy to. I'll be super
Yeah.
interested to hear about.
No, I do. So I guess my generation is, I guess, what they call like the it's so funny. I'm saying like I'm an old man. We're post
Yeah.
Oslo kids. So we're like the first new generation that has this new world. So
Hmm.
the thing is, in the 80s, so before Oslo, in the 80s, you could still, if you're from like Jenin, you could go to Nazareth if you really wanted to.
Mm,
Yeah.
My
After
mom
Israel
still did
occupied.
field trips, in the to the north or to the occupied Syrian Golan Heights.
Hmm.
So it's just random when I hear like, oh yeah, I've been to this city or that city, like
Hmm.
Haifa or Nazareth or Acre. Like I've been to those places like in the 80s or the early 90s, but by the time of Oslo and the checkpoints expanded in the Intifada, but a lot of the stuff is from the early to mid 90s.
Hmm.
And it was like the new leaders of the Palestinian Authority kind of had like these VIP passes where they could just breeze through these checkpoints, but not us.
Yeah.
So it was just like, oh, was this really the peace plan? Oh, I
Mm.
don't know.
Yeah. It seems like it was definitely a benefit for one tiny sect of the population, but not the rest.
Yeah,
Um,
and that was a set of the population that recently was brought back.
yes.
That was in
Yeah.
exile for a while or had never lived there. So, with the first Intifada in the late 80s, a lot of that, a lot of Palestinian leaders in exile kind of, in a way, took credit for what the people were revolting.
Yeah.
And so people like Arafat and his group, and I mean, I guess groups, a lot of them didn't fully understand what was happening on the ground in the
Mm.
Gaza Strip, which is, I believe, where the first Intifada really started,
Yeah.
or the West Bank. They didn't fully grasp the material nature and how we were operating there.
I mean, they were removed for a long time, right? Because after Black September, they got kicked out of Jordan to Lebanon. Then Israel kicked them out of
Yes.
Lebanon into Tunis. And then they're like, holy crap, we've been removed from decades. And Israel is going through the Intifada again. And they're saying, oh my gosh, we need someone to deal with. How about instead of Hamas, we bring in these guys again? And that got them their green ticket back.
Yeah, yeah, and Hamas was still very new. I think their main like military style attacks were in the early 90s,
Yeah.
uh, not even really in the late 80s. So it was just like, oh, we need somebody to represent. Who can we
Yeah.
get? Oh, yeah, this guy that we fought, Arafat.
Yeah. That renounced
Uh,
violence in Lebanon. Let's pull them back. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
yeah, and it was
I'm
just a tough time.
Yeah, it was 100% was. And were you were alive during the Second Intifada. Do you have
Yeah,
any memories? And you were in the land at that point. Do you have any memories from then? And was it a tough time? I mean,
yeah.
I know from Palestinians here that it was a very scary time, but it was also a time of what they saw as potentially something for change, and there was some hope, but there was also, of course, fear. And as you said, you were around the age of second grade. What was your experience like?
Yeah, so a lot of the, I guess, hope kind of died in it. Well, for those that saw hope, but I think a lot of the hope died in like 99 or 2000,
Okay, end
after
of Oslo.
I believe it was a Camp David summit.
Yeah.
But I think when Sharon and his military entered the Alexa compound, and the thing is, it wasn't so much that, oh, the soon-to-be prime minister and a bunch of military were entering Al-Aqsa. It was who he was. It
Yeah.
was this guy was behind the Sabra and Shatila massacre in the 80s in Beirut,
Yeah.
and
His name,
a lot of
his nickname was the
people.
Bulldozer Beirut. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it wasn't just that what happened, it was who it was as
Hmm.
well. So that, and shortly after, I believe Arafat was put under house arrest at the Muqata'a, his base in Ramallah.
Yeah.
And so from that point, it was like, okay, something is really rough. So there was a lot of different roads that were blocked off with Israeli bulldozers and jeeps.
Hmm.
The how to say, so there's way more checkpoints, and it really chokes the outside of every urban center of what they call Area A.
Yeah.
And so it is between areas B and C as well. But anytime you leave one urban center, you have a checkpoint, and sometimes these checkpoints were in the urban center itself.
Hmm.
So your restriction on movement, I remember for a while we couldn't go to class because we weren't allowed to leave our houses.
Wow.
So they call it منع تجول, which is, restriction on, moving, or تجول is like kind of making rounds.
Sure.
You couldn't do that. So for a while, you couldn't leave your building,
Yeah.
because they were surveying the entire area for any fighters or just anybody really, that they see. So what that does is, a lot of your stores are closed, your economy is restricted more, you're creating an air of fear. And then also there are times where when it comes to movement, you don't know if you can go to certain cities or areas that you did last week. There might
Wow.
be two soldiers who are 18 years old operating the dividing barrier between to enter your town. Tulkarm had
Mm.
like a yellow gate at a town called Anabta.
Hmm.
And so what you would usually do is you would take a bus from, let's say, Ramallah. You take the bus, go through a bunch of checkpoints, then you get to that gate, and then you would crawl below the yellow gate and meet a taxi on the other side to get you to Kerim itself. But
Wow.
there would be days where there'd be no taxis, but two soldiers on the other end, and they're telling you go back, go back. They don't give you a reason. They don't care what passport you have, but they'll start shooting rounds, the live ammunition. They'll do tear gas. They'll do I don't know if they call them sound grenades, but it just kind of releases sound, doesn't really like produce fire or combustion.
No, exactly. The
Um,
one you hear the ringing afterwards. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's really like loud
Right.
because it's just so much pressurized like sound.
Yeah, it's supposed to
Yeah.
destroy
Um,
you.
and so you would kind of have to sneak into the city. So sometimes we would sneak in through hills with no paved road, but you can see the Israeli like watchtowers
Hmm.
around. And at the time, I think drones were still pretty new. So the drones were not so much the ones with the fans, but they looked like balloons.
Mm.
Okay.
Uh, so one would like fly outside of my window like a lot, and you could see it's flying low and blinking red and green lights. So it's taking images.
Yeah, taking
Uh,
photos. Yeah.
so that was part of it too. Yeah.
Man, I mean, it's crazy because it doesn't sound like anything has gotten better since your childhood. I mean, as far as
No.
I concerned, like the drone issue, it's 10 times worse. Palestinian children have,
Very advanced. Yeah.
yes. Yeah. And Palestinian children say, look, we have PTSD because we hear the sounds of the drones. And whenever we hear anything in the sky, we're always like, holy crap, it's a drone. Movement has been even further restricted. The last time I was in the West Bank, the most salient memory was you couldn't really go a few streets without having one of those watchtowers. And they have a sniper point at you all the way through as you're driving through every time. So it's definitely not progressed to say the least. Um,
Yeah.
I want to get a little more into the historical knowledge you have because going through your page, it just seems like you're a history buff at every level. And I want to talk a little bit about Tulkarem because I know Tulkarem has a very interesting history, and me and Hayan were briefly touching on this before you entered the call. A lot of people don't know a lot of its original population was Kurdish during Salahuddin and a lot of Kurds coming over to the Holy Land. And I want to know about your personal roots with you and your village and whether you go back to those Kurdish roots or maybe your family has a different origin story, but we would love to hear that, man.
Oh, it's interesting. You know that. So should I go like really far
As
of
far as
myself
you'd
or just
like, as
Tulkarm
far
as a
as you'd
Yeah,
city?
man.
like.
The deeper the
Uh,
better, honestly. We'd love to
Yeah.
hear it,
so,
bro. Yeah.
so interestingly enough, Tulkarm, so I'm not trying to bash my city, not trying to bash my city, but it's not as well known as our neighbors like Nablus or Jenin. So Tulkarm as a modern foundation with that name attached is kind of around like post Crusades, yeah. So like Salahuddin,
Makes
so like
sense.
1100s, you could say, sort of
Yeah.
new city. But
Mhm.
the old Canaanite name is very different. It was Birat Suraika. Birat Suraika.
Yeah.
Um, Spelling it's weird, Birat and then Soreqa. Birat
Okay.
Suraika. You can find that online, but also there's a Tulkarm museum that goes through in downtown. It's free. It's kind of nice. It's mainly a lot of farmer stuff. So
The
if
one
you
you
want to
work
learn
at, the
all
same
about
one?
the farming and basketry, it's a
Is it
cool
the same one
place.
that you work at?
No, so the one I work at is in DC, Museum of the Palestinian People.
Okay.
But this one is just Tulkarm. This one's
Okay, wow.
Wow.
in Tulkarm itself, like
And
Awesome.
it
in
goes
the
from
square.
Oh, in Tulkarem
goes from
itself. Okay, okay.
yeah, and it goes from the Canaanite history all the way to the modern day.
Yeah, yeah. So they have some artifacts from old. There's one that looks almost like a Medusa head. I don't know if it's a Roman era or before, but there's one I saw that was like it's the size of my fist and it had the eyes. And I was like, oh, she's pretty. Uh, um, so the Aramaic name was since before Arabic took off, the Semitic language in the region, not just Palestine, but Syria as a whole, Greater Syria, it was Aramaic for the most part, or Western Aramaic. So it was Tur Kerma. So Tur
Mm.
being mountain, and Karma is kind of like vineyard, and that goes into the Arabic where Tul means length, and Karm is like Karm al-Anab, which is a grapevine.
Hmm.
So because at the over there, some historic sites you might find are they're pretty dilapidated, unfortunately. Like maintaining sites is very difficult under occupation, but also corruption within
Yeah.
Palestinian Authority. There's a lot of Roman presses, so there's areas of olive pressing and grape pressing that you can find, and it's actually on the line on the West Bank, little border in an area called
Mm.
Taiba. So that's one little area. Then it was a really big site for the 1936 revolt in Palestine against the British Mandate. Kind of demanding a halt on immigration of Jews from Europe because it was kind of the foundation to promise a Jewish state without, the permission of the people there. And basically, a lot of the times, if you wanted to have your own state, they were kind of telling us, you can just go to, just like today, you can go to Jordan or you can go to Iraq, and it's like, dude, so you're creating a lot of state institutions for a new population that hadn't even been there for a lot of them hadn't been there for a decade even.
Mm.
So, before people will say, "Oh, we hate Jews," it's like, no, that's not. We didn't choose their culture or their religion.
Yeah.
If they were Portuguese or Somali or whatever, we would have had similar sentiment. But because the British are backing a state building project and all the institutions that even have the name Palestine are mainly from the new Jewish immigrants, post office, banking, police, sports teams,
Yep.
we were not represented in a lot of these
Mm.
areas. So some of the earliest, members of the revolt were from Tulkarem, because a lot of them were peasantry going away from some of even the feudal lords in Palestine at the time who were very disconnected from the majority.
Mm.
Um, Now, some other interesting historic places is in the Ottoman days, we were actually one of the stops on the Hijaz Railway, which connected
Wow.
Damascus to Medina.
Mm.
Never got finished to Mecca because of World War One. But we were, if you look at the map, it says, if you zoom in, it says Nablus, but if you zoom in closer, like we're actually on that little branch line as well. So we have a tunnel that goes through Tulkarem, and the tunnel is still there. The tracks are all gone because it really was destroyed, but the tunnel is still there.
And
Um,
I
how
hope
did
to see a revival of that train, man.
I hope
yeah,
so too. It'd be nice.
Inshallah.
no, inshallah. And how did Tulkarem deal with the Nakba in 1948? Did most of their population get to stay, or was there mass expulsions as in other places?
So because the sub-district itself, about 60% of what the district was ended up in the new Israeli state. And that's where Netanya would be.
Yep.
Um, the many so if you see some old pictures of the Nakba, some of the more popular pictures where they end up in the West Bank, a lot of them are actually going to Tulkarem, from
Wow.
like some of the coastal towns like Haifa and
Mm.
Jaffa.
Hmm.
So in Tulkarem, we have two big refugee camps. There is Tulkarem camp and Nur Shemes camp. I used to
Hmm.
hang out in Nur Shemes camp a lot as a kid, actually.
Wow.
I used to get falafel sandwiches there. It was a time. Um, so it was. I'm not sure if I don't know if Tulkarem is maybe the third largest refugee camp in the West Bank. I
Hmm.
believe Balata in Nablus is the largest, maybe Jenin the second largest.
Hmm. That makes
But many of the refugees in there are from the coast, which includes maybe what was the former district of Tulkarem that's now in Israel.
sense.
Um, so yeah, so even so, because Jordan ended up annexing those areas, so a lot of people didn't have it. A lot of people that weren't from the coast itself were still in Tulkarem, but if many of them moved, it's because also a lot of agricultural land, the orange groves extended.
Hmm.
We couldn't have that anymore. So many of them had to go to bigger cities like
Is that
Nablus, or maybe go to Jordan.
That makes sense. Is that part of, was there an economic connection between Tulkarem and the other coastal cities? Because I know, of course, oranges, Jaffa oranges, right? It was a very
Yeah.
coastal based trade. So was there economic relations that made people want to go to Tulkarem rather than say other places? Because I know, like in the Lid and Ramleh death marches, most of them went to Ramallah or other places that were more,
Yeah, even Gaza Strip as well.
exactly, yeah. But so
Um,
what was the unique feature of Tulkarem that made people gravitate there?
so I would say it was more so like, well, before the Nakba, I was more so people from Tulkarem going out there
Oh,
into the
hmm,
coast. But again, like
yeah,
the coast wasn't very far. It was like, I mean, people weren't really driving that much, but ideally it's 20
yeah,
minutes away.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but I think like, we have pretty solid agricultural lands when it comes to olives and figs. But it was just nice to be able to, for us to go to bigger cities like Jaffa, and neighboring areas to do trade. Even my grandfather, while yes, he is from Tulkarem, my grandfather was actually born 1895. Funny enough, passed away in late 70s. But he worked. He wasn't born in Jaffa, but he worked in Jaffa, and he
Hmm,
would ship oranges to like Beirut and Cyprus.
amazing. Wow.
And then with the Nakba, I mean, you might say he's luckier than most because he just went back to Tulkarem. I couldn't
Hmm.
stay in Jaffa, but a lot of people didn't have a place to go back to. He already had family in the place he was born.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but his first two kids, they were born in Jaffa, but that's a little bit of how it goes.
Yeah.
Um, Switching gears a little bit, like Trump now, like just back to the modern times, like Trump right now is like floating a plan to, occupy or annex Gaza for the US to own it, to redevelop it or whatever. He's kind of gone back and forth. I don't know where he stands because this guy changes his mind based on whoever talked to him last. I swear to God, like he'll
Yeah.
Yeah,
literally
because
like,
Mel talked to him today. Yeah, he's only like, "Oh, I'll take in 2,000 cancer kits from Gaza or the West Bank or something." So,
He's
yeah,
like,
so
I didn't know they had, I didn't know they had it. It's like, okay.
bro, he's so like flippant, so like I don't know where he stands on whether or not they stay, but like what do you think most Palestinians feel like? Do you think as a Syrian, like I saw someone post about how, we should accept Palestinian refugees, and bro, of course, if they're exiled like by force, like I would accept them. Like I've seen a video where a guy in Idlib like 2 years ago, when the war like first started, he said like I'll give them my home and I'll live in the streets. Like
hmm,
to talking about Gazans. Like Syrians have all the love in the world for Palestinians, but I know
Mhm.
a lot of Palestinians now like do they take any opportunity they can to flee if they can, or are most Palestinians, do you think, like kind of holding steady and thinking like we can't leave, they're just not going to let us back, and this is just a way to continue erasing more and more of our population?
I think so. I guess I could think of it like a coin. There is the steadfastness and that portion where it's like, no, I'm not going to leave. You guys, be it Israelis or other Arab countries, have told us, you'll be safe here, or it's better to do this. But we know that our parents or grandparents, they didn't see their original hometowns, like whether it was Ascalon or Majdal or Bir Saba, or these places again. So it's like there's part of it where it's like, no, we've already been displaced many times. We're going to stay to it.
Mm,
But then, I would say maybe that's in the Gaza Strip, especially. But in the West Bank, it's like, although it's I hate saying better, it's a
less worse,
very, very
maybe.
low standard of better.
Yeah.
hmm,
It's a lot of, at least the young people. It's like as much as they are steadfast or resilient, it's the reality is some of them don't feel like there is much of a future that they have to start their lives.
yeah,
And even if, like, let's say, a lot of us send money to our families, be it in Palestine or Lebanon or wherever. Um, Another thing is like, let's say my family over there can be good. Materially, they'll be okay, like if we send them money or help out. but then are they able to go to that bank to actually pull out that money?
Mm.
Because the city might be shut down another week. The bank might not have things in Israeli shekel or Jordanian dinar or US dollar. They might not have that available. So
Mm.
even if we're able to cover a lot of things, here in diaspora,
Mm.
it's can they get it there? So there's just so many things that are unsustainable. And being that the refugee camps, I think the most recent report said 40,000 people have been displaced from the northern West Bank refugee camps between Tulkarem, Jenin, and Tubas, which is closer to Jordan.
Mm.
Uh, it's all over the place, really. It's there's not much. I don't know if I can give like a definite answer,
Yeah,
but
no,
it's all over the place,
it is.
depending on the generation you are.
And the
Mm.
location, and yeah, and I mean, yeah, it's hard to have hope, but like, we were talking about it in another episode, like it was really difficult for the Jewish people to have hope of having a homeland one day, and then it just happened. And like it was difficult for Syrians to imagine Syria without Assad, and then it happened. And so my hope, inshallah, like it's really difficult to imagine a free Palestine, and then it's just gonna happen.
Yeah.
And like I've seen some positive signs. Like, do you think Jared Kushner is still gonna push through with his Abraham Accords, or do you think Saudi Arabia is kind of like turning a tide a little bit? They seem to be a little more, I don't know, critical of Israel these days. Do you find that like a positive sign? Are you encouraged by it?
That's something I'm very on the fence with because even before October 7th, I think they were getting really close to
Yeah.
normalizing with Saudi.
Yeah.
But also because there is like you could say a new Middle East, it's post, I don't even want to say post this genocide, but it's like one wave of it has ended. But then you also have like a new Syrian administration trying to, reconnect with the world.
Hmm.
But especially you want your neighbors to be connected.
Hmm.
But then, it's also what then the sovereignty of these other countries, being like Egypt and Jordan, are being threatened and saying, "Hey, if you kick them out, we'll go to war." But it's also that some of these countries are also super reliant on the U.S., like Jordan and Egypt,
Yeah, they're not.
especially with pausing of U.S. aid.
Yeah, they're not gonna go to
Uh,
war.
they're not going to go to war,
Yeah,
but it's just like they can't even flex
exactly. That's
or
what I'm saying.
even
Like these
stand. Yeah, they can't
these
stand
flexes
on
have been
ethics anymore.
nothing. Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
If you don't have water, like it's. But then with Saudi, it's really Saudi is like the I feel like the big Arab domino that if
Mm.
they do normalize, I think a lot of other Arab countries, like maybe I sound pessimistic, I feel like a lot of other Arab countries are probably going to as well.
Mm,
Yeah.
And I mean, the thing is, Saudi has had this rhetoric before where, hey, we reject these comments, okay, yeah, there's words.
yeah, yeah.
I
But
mean, I'm
there's
not
talk of
saying you're
it
going to
being
go
a
out full
condition.
war,
There's talk
but
of it like like maybe it normalizing with Israel. Like I've heard of it being a condition that a two-state solution will
Ceasefire.
actually be implemented along with a
yeah,
ceasefire, of course.
Yeah.
That may be more like uh Allahu A'lam, like just talk, but I don't know. I find it encouraging after
It,
years of complete silence on the issue, right? Like
I mean,
it looked like it was just all but guaranteed that they were going to normalize.
there was a track to get them to change their language to get Israel to agree to be on track to have a two-state solution, not that they will agree to a two-state solution. So I think
Mm,
Saudi has been slowly trying to walk it back themselves, and
I
with
hope so,
Trump,
man.
probably, yeah, they'll probably cave, sadly.
Yeah.
Those men. But speaking of a ceasefire, I think one thing like everyone in the media has been pondering is this even a legitimate ceasefire, right? I don't want to use the words of Kamala Harris, but what many people have speculated is it's more of a humanitarian pause for 42 days, and then Israel will go back in and continue the onslaught. Um, It sounds like that was the mindset Trump has had. It sounded like in his talks with Netanyahu, he iterated that it will be a very temporary measure. You'll be able to go back in and bomb. I think it was Netanyahu with Smoltrich who also said that do not leave the coalition, right? This is not a permanent ceasefire. We're just going to get back a few hostages and we'll go back in and finish off the job in his language. I contrast that with the sentiments I saw coming out of many Palestinian communities. It seemed like a time of actual jubilance for once in a very dark period of Palestinians celebrating, getting the ceasefire. So contrasting that hope with the real politic and pragmatism that he's probably going to continue the genocide starting in the next few weeks. How have you perceived these past few weeks, and what do you think is going to come?
Yeah, I mean, between Zionism and the Israel friendship or alliance is very embedded in U.S. politics, and so even more recently, I think Hamas leaders were even saying, "Hey, we're gonna pause this hostage swap
Yeah,
because since the start of the ceasefire." 110 people in Gaza were already killed, and you're not shipping in enough trucks. Not enough trucks are getting in,
yeah,
and you're also talking about annexing us
Yeah,
still. So it's going to be another. Oh, look what Hamas did. They
yeah,
don't want to give the hostages back, and it's like, yeah, there's not much of a crutch they can really stand on.
yeah,
But even if the full swap happens that's also the double-edged sword of it is even if Israel gets all their hostages back,
Mhm.
and even if we get more, maybe another 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, hostages back, uh, we're still going to get attacked, and some of those people that Israel gave back are going to come back in
wow,
as
Yeah,
well. So it just feels like you know, right now we're just trying to stand on like, our just steadfastness alone.
yeah,
But we don't have much much support other than sympathy and words, you
yeah.
know.
Was besides the sympathy and words, I mean, what tangible measures could the Arab world do to prevent Israel from trying to go back in and annex? Is there any leverage at all, or is it just the threat of going to war? Right, Jordan has said, or Sisi trying to be a strong man and say, "Oh, we won't let that happen. We'll rebuild Gaza ourselves." What leverage is there to prevent Israel from trying to attenuate their expansionist desires?
So I mean, I always I guess I'm thinking of it also like economically. Now
Yeah,
I mean, this is probably going to get these Arab countries into a war, but if you pause using their resources or using their trade routes,
yeah,
because
or
the Houthis in Yemen have already stopped the shipments going through the Red Sea, but that's not a U.S. ally.
mm,
yeah,
Now, if Egypt stops Suez Canal to trade for U.S. shipments,
mm,
that will set off the world.
yeah,
And
yeah,
if Saudi does an embargo on their oil, like they did previously back in the 70s, I believe,
70s, yeah,
yeah.
um,
73 forward. Yeah,
yeah. So that, economic power and leverage is really big. But that's also like it's going to lead to, also being, being bombed, bombarded, and it's that's the only like slight leverage in a sense, but that doesn't mean they have a military leverage. That's
yeah.
my guess
maybe
is
economic, but
I mean, I would expect if Jordan actually declared war on Israel, Israel would use that as a pretext to invade Jordan, potentially even use that as a land grab within Jordan itself, and maybe say, "Oh, we're going to relocate Palestinians there, and that will be the solution and be it all." But in terms of economic power, I mean, a big thing we in America champion is BDS, right? Boycott, divestment, and sanctions.
yeah.
In your eyes, for nonviolent activism, has BDS been effective? Have there been any tangible gains from the BDS movement? And I assume that it's something that you personally partake in.
Yeah.
Do you find that since October 7th, it's been a movement that's grown, that a lot of people have joined on? Anything about BDS that you have thoughts on, we would love to hear, man.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if people are looking for like peaceful forms of activism, hit them where the money is. So it like to see a lot of different brands, like let's say big brands, and if you do, you don't like it's hard to boycott every single company in the world, but that's why you do targeted boycotts where maybe you focus on five places, and if it's many people, like let's say you boycott McDonald's at least, that it does end up hurting their dollar. And if even somewhere like let's say Ben and Jerry's that pulled out of just the West Bank,
Hmm.
that's still, you're
Yeah.
destroying part of the settler economy,
Hmm.
because some of those resources, especially fresh water, are in the West Bank.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Um, and I feel like, yeah, knowing that, thousands of businesses in Israel have closed, and a lot of the reliance Israel has economically is really on support from the U.S.
Yeah.
It just if you think about it, if the government didn't use the tax money for Israel,
Yeah.
militarily especially, then they could have lost a lot of power maybe a
Of
decade ago.
course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Similar to South Africa at the time, there wasn't much other support they were really getting by the 80s or 90s.
Mm.
So I really do think, boycott, divestment, and sanctions is very big. And even Spain, which has stepped up a lot, not allowing ships that are going to Israel or Israeli ships docking on their
This is
shores.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this
Uh,
is what I wanted to talk. Yeah, I think like eventually, like another thing is like the Israeli bonds that I used to get ads for. Like I used to like scroll through social media and get
oh
ads for
man,
investing in Israeli bonds. Those are crashing too, right? Like that's not a good sign because that's basically like
Hmm.
a long-term investment into the country's like future.
yeah,
And so yeah, like I think that that's also like kind of how South Africa fell is it also just became very unpopular for world governments to continue supporting it. And I think we're seeing a bit of the tide turning now where, politicians are literally using Israel to score points by calling out Israel, saying, Israel is bad. Like I'm sure Spain got more popular, like the leader of Spain, I don't know who they are, but I'm sure that I think it's a woman. I'm sure she.
I think it's a dude. I think it's a
It
guy.
is? Okay, I don't, yeah, I don't remember. But yeah,
yeah.
like I'm sure they got like some boost in numbers for it, and I think we're gonna see more and more of that like worldwide,
I mean,
especially like
Ireland.
in Latin American countries and Arab countries. Like I think Saudi Arabia, like the leader is a lot more popular if he stands up to Israel than if he doesn't.
Yeah.
Um, Turkey
I mean,
definitely. Like, yeah, go ahead.
countries like Ireland have a lot of street cred in the Middle East for their stances on Palestine.
Hmm.
I think, like literally, if you go like a street in Northern Ireland from the Unionists into the other portions, you'll see like Israel flags and then Palestine flags, right? And then
Yeah.
in the Republic side, right, it's a whole division, and they get a lot of credit for that across the
Hmm.
Arab world and Latin America, like you said. But I think there is a domino effect. I think it was one of the Nordic countries, I forget which one, but they started labeling products made in the West Bank, made in West Bank settlements, right?
Mm.
And so, as Haitham said, right, that's attacking the settler infrastructure directly.
Mm.
If people can read this is made in a West Bank settlements, many people are going to say, oh my God, that's the most extreme of Israeli society, right? I'm not going to touch that. And so
Yeah.
these are little things, and I do think they definitely add up for sure.
And I
Mm.
think people forget like the port of Eilat on the Red Sea that went bankrupt a few months ago. Like
Hmm.
that's a pretty big shipping port for Israel.
Nice.
Primarily because of the Houthis, right? Because of the actions of the Houthis
Yeah,
in the Red Sea. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And I mean, even in Tel Aviv, I think there was so many tech and development in like corporations leaving for America because they said it's no longer profitable to be in Israel. And I
Yeah.
think that was like in the first few months after October 7th.
Yeah.
So
Mm.
yeah, BDS is definitely having an effect. Um, but slightly switching gears back to the West Bank, we have seen recent provocations in the West Bank. And coming from this from a very Zionist perspective, if you, as someone who's Jewish, I'm very much immersed within their world and what they're saying. In Zionist historiography, they care a lot more about the West Bank than they do Gaza, right? To them, that is Judea and Samaria. That's the heartland. That's what they want to annex most and foremost. And so, to me, it's an interesting dichotomy that Gaza's the body that's receiving so much violence, but in reality, in their desires, the West Bank is their prime desire. So why do you think Gaza is on the receiving end of so much violence? Is it solely due to resistance because of Hamas's position in Gaza? And the West Bank doesn't, because in my eyes, the West Bank should be their focus point.
So I feel like, especially with Gaza, and of course, it didn't, pre 2006,
Yeah.
of course, they didn't have as many settlements. I mean, also due to landmass, it didn't have as many settlements as the West Bank was. But also, I mean, the attacks on Gaza are mainly kind of to trap Hamas and also blame the people there for it. But also, I mean, Gaza historically, even from the 50s, was a place that gave Israel a very difficult time.
Hmm.
Resistance going back to the 50s when Egypt owned the area as well,
Hmm.
which also pissed off Egypt a little bit.
Wasn't
Um,
it the founder of Hamas, I think it was, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, was imprisoned by Nasser for being an Islamist, right? I think that I think he had a
yeah,
prison.
because the Muslim Brotherhood was outlawed,
Yeah.
early. So especially, yeah, the 50s, definitely. And so, some of the massacres that happened in Khan Yunis, that was like, I think in 56, I want to say. That was,
Yeah.
slightly after the, when was the Suez crisis again? 50, was that also 56?
Yeah, it's 56. Yeah.
Yeah, so around then, so whatever was happening in the Suez between Britain, France, Israel, and Egypt, that also affected people in Gaza, Khan Yunis, and Rafah.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Um, and also, I mean, it's a coastal territory, so it's just like it's also, yeah, a way to really cut off and trap you more. But within the West Bank, now if there's different lenses and kind of the interesting, maybe unfortunate part about our region is there's historical context and there's biblical context, which is
Yeah.
always really annoying.
Yeah.
So I try to say things with historical context, but biblical context, branching into even Quranic context, it can be a clash of ideology
Yeah.
uh, versus filling in blanks of history. But the thing is, because biblically, a lot of the early stories of the kingdoms in Israel from Saul, David, Solomon are in that region, and also being around Jerusalem. That is a very big focal point. While they technically annexed East Jerusalem in 1980 or 81, around that time, um, to get more, the thing is, having that Palestinian Authority there, that that was something they've been wanting to dismantle. Honestly, sometimes we joke, get rid of it, whatever, but it's not going to go back to before the 90s either. But being that these are very rich areas, biblically, historically, as someone that loves history, of course, there's Jewish history within the region,
Hmm.
but it's to use it as the only as it, like I always say, all these histories are not the first, only, or last,
Hmm.
but it is the way it is weaponized to destroy another population.
Hmm.
That is
Yeah.
the danger of it. And especially, it, like if you find an artifact of an old synagogue or temple or even bath, it easily a settlement will be built right on it.
Yeah.
So it's also a way to absorb more. It is the prime spot to absorb more land. Also, the West Bank has a lot of fresh water resources, or from between the Jordan River around the Dead Sea through that valley.
Hmm.
It's a prime location for farming as well. Yeah, or at least for fresh water. A lot of the
Hmm.
best farms are in the Galilee. So you have a strategic point, a biblical connection, a freshwater resource, and you have more land to expand on. So that's why it's kind of like a very prime location.
Yeah, and
It's
yeah, go ahead.
I think it's great. I mean, last time I lived in the West Bank for a few months, and I remember meeting a Palestinian who said he was literally expelled from his village. It was near Jerusalem because of excavations, right? And so it's a tool that the state of Israel uses to kick Palestinians off their land, especially like you said, in biblically relevant sites. Um, and you touched on it a little bit in your comments, but it's so ironic that Israel likes to center one history in the land at the expense of everyone else. And I say it's ironic because when you take a historical context of who were the Israelites they were likely a derivative of the Canaanites, right? Who are the Palestinian people today? They also descend from these ancient peoples of the land. So they're elevating this one unique aspect of history in the land, even though there were still other peoples in the land, the Jebusites, Canaanites, all these other groups simultaneously. They elevate this one people and say, this is the exclusive group that gets to own the land. It's a ludicrous argument. I mean, it's BS if you're going to use that to expel mass swaths of people in the land and elevate this one group. And it's sad that that is still playing out today in the West Bank.
And that's the tough part, especially with like, Christian evangelicals in the US. Christian evangelicals outnumber, Zionists or Jewish Zionists
Yeah,
specifically, and so because a lot of their legislation or their thoughts, they don't have to be Republican,
yeah,
center around the Bible. And it's like also what's difficult about our region is that a lot of moments in the Bible and then moments in history don't always match up, or if they kind of match, they might be like a this stark of a difference.
yeah.
And like let's say, I'll just give one example, like the walls of Jericho being blown down by the was it the shofar or the
Yes,
you know
they blew the ram's horn beforehand, and then they fell, and then
yeah.
Joshua's army massacred them. Yeah, exactly.
And so biblically, okay, but like historically, that area has earthquakes a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the last big earthquake in that region was 1927. It destroyed like Nablus's old city was leveled big time in 27.
And
And so
I think
uh,
they did
yeah,
literal analysis on the walls, and based on the time period in the Bible, it's impossible. It happened like millennia before like the Israelites like were even an identity. So they were definitely like claiming a story that didn't happen for themselves, which it's wild, man.
yeah.
And
So if
they're
you
only
want like early stories that could help out with like the even let's say Kingdom of Israel or David or something, you mainly look at the people that wrote the most, which was ancient Egypt and the Assyrians,
Yeah.
because they invaded and wrote the most. And so, names they mention, yeah, those are names of people like or areas that they fought. But yeah, it's just how the biblical justification is used on everything. Meanwhile, some churches talk about protecting Christians worldwide from these bad Muslims when it's like even the Christians from the original place of Christians are
Are being
not
slaughtered
being
by Israel.
protected
Yeah,
whatsoever. So
yeah.
especially Gaza, like outside of Jerusalem, Gaza was like the second or third place, one of the earliest places in the Levant that was a center of Christianity too.
Yeah.
oh, wow.
Yeah. And I had friends from the Al Zaytun neighborhood who were some of the last Christian, or their family members were the last Christians in Gaza, and they were related to the two women that got sniped. Like it's ludicrous.
Yeah.
On the question of evangelicals, because I feel like in America our discourse is so influenced by religious language and how
Uh-huh.
much money they have the ability to pour in. I think statistically, the most financially capable organization that's a Zionist organization isn't even Jewish run. It's Christians United for Israel. It's run by this pastor in Texas, John Hagee. It's so crazy to me, but it dominates our discourse, right? I think it's rare to not see a conversation about Israel without some evangelical influence. But something I came to realize growing up in the South is that a lot of these individuals are inherently anti-Semitic, right? The reason they want Jews in the land is for them to die, for Jesus to
For
come
the
back.
Messiah, yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And from a Palestinian perspective, like even in your conversations with Palestinian Christians, I mean, how is that perceived? Is it just perceived as like this like really messed up idea that Western Christians have, or like is there anyone that takes it seriously? I mean, what is the Palestinian mindset on evangelicals?
So I guess how would we say in Arabic, like Injiliyin, right? For the
Yeah,
evangelicals. So it's very so at least for Palestinian Christians themselves in all the interviews I see, or even any Eastern Christian, be it from Syria, Lebanon, Coptic from Egypt, or Chaldean from Iraq,
yeah,
it's like, do these people like forget about us? Are we like, do they see us as like another brown group?
yeah, exactly.
Like, do they not know like these monasteries and places are right here? And
Hmm.
like, it's crazy. I growing up, I always used to think like, do they think Bethlehem is just some fictional place? Like, you can still go get food there, right? it boggles my mind. And it was just like all these little traditions that were there. It's how like even going to Orientalism is how you took pictures of these people. You know, these old reports on, you know, there was the Palestinian Exploration Fund or the surveys of Western Palestine and Syria, and it's like these people lived like they did in the Bible, and it's like, okay, whoa. I mean, we have some things we
Yeah.
maintain, but we're also pretty diverse. Like, you know, like, yeah, we're Arab, but Arab is also super diverse. We have a lot of different histories, not just Arab, many other
Sure
groups.
it is.
A lot of us have spoken different languages. We've
Yeah.
on trade routes. I mean, we lived in the Ottoman Empire. Like, some people used to go to schools in different cities and just
Hmm.
travel, and it was like, what? You could go from Damascus to Baghdad? That's unheard of now.
Yeah.
Unimaginable.
Um, so it's just like, you know, even the idea of, you know, they see us as backwards of, you know, the land without a people for a people without a land. And it's like, how can you have so many urban centers and just say that there's nobody there? And do you
Mm.
expect villages and rural areas, which exist everywhere, to be like New York or Chicago or something? Like, they're supposed to look like that. Like, these
Yeah.
dry places are dry because they're dry.
Also, like the way that they've, kind of taken over their own religion in America and in Europe, like, how the depiction of white Jesus and how they've incorporated their own kind of history with manifest destiny into their idea of Christianity. They obviously don't think back of Palestinians or like, as the Middle East as the home of Christianity. They think like, God country is right here, right in America, So I think that kind of like the idea of a black Jesus, how that's so controversial to them, is like it literally like haunts their dreams to imagine that. But
Yeah,
if there was a more kind of connection to their religion to Palestine, like it would be more, I think they would think more about Palestinian Christians. But right now, the way that Christianity is weaponized in the USA by Republicans, by politicians in general, it's a political tool for nationalism, basically. It's all it is.
even saying happy holidays is just like,
It's a
oh,
cultural
I'm like,
signifier
okay,
now. Yeah, you're woke if you say that.
oh my God. Yeah, like I can name scholars of, you know, the three Abrahamic faiths from Gaza alone, you know,
Hmm.
that have contributed a lot to, you know, scripture, spirituality, and whatnot. You know, it's like, to why would any of you guys like, it's people's care for this has only been through the Bible versus like, oh, I'm actually curious, like, oh, interesting cities or routes,
And
you
they're only
know.
going to double down on it more because religion is so effective at like convincing people in a compulsive way to like follow this idea. They're only going to double down on it more by like we talked about it in previous episode with David, like by weaponizing Judaism and Christianity to use it as like a defensive shield for your identity. Like so if you don't like if you're against Palestinians being ethnically cleansed, oh, you're anti-Semitic, like you're and Christians will go along with that. Like evangelical Christians will go along with it because it suits their own faith as well to usher in the rapture or whatever when the end times will
Yeah,
come.
yeah, and you know, even historically, even excavations, you know, a lot of excavations throughout our region, you know, they're very new. They're very like 1890s, we want to say, 1880s.
Hmm.
Like, a lot of these things in the ground were not always, you know, focused on necessarily until, you know, you had a lot more like, you know, consulates, like, you know, French expeditionaries, English, Dutch, a lot of people that wrote, even, you know, somewhere like Petra, you know, at one point in history, it was quote unquote lost,
Hmm.
until somebody wandered in like the 1800s and saw the big treasury,
Hmm.
hasn't he? So it's like, oh, okay. But it's like these things were not the focus of people. So excavations,
Mm,
I don't know about worldwide, but at least
right.
you know, where we're from, these things, nobody started digging that much
Mm.
until, you know, a
Even among
hundred,
like
150 years.
among Muslims, like we kind of see studying pre-Muslim history as like, what are you doing? Like those are the jahils, you don't need, what do you need to know about them? They're the ignorant ones.
Yeah,
Hmm.
even I'll tell you this. So, for example, within during the British Mandate of Palestine, there's a Palestinian archaeologist named Dimitri Baramki.
Hmm.
I believe he's from, I want to say he's from Jerusalem or Bethlehem. He did excavations in the 30s, and you know he was one of the few actually like you know non-British people doing excavations
Mm,
of where he's from. And
Hmm.
he found Hisham's palace, which has the largest floor mosaic in the Middle East.
Hmm.
And from that was an early, it wasn't like a mosque, but it was built by one of the caliph's sons, Hisham bin Abdul Malik.
Hmm.
He built like a desert palace with a nice floor mosaic.
Is
He
that the one in
found,
Jericho?
yeah,
Is,
yeah.
yeah, that's the one in Jericho. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was found, that was fully found in the, or recovered in the 30s. He also found the Jericho Synagogue as well. It had an old mosaic floor, and it even had like the old, I would say, I don't know if it was Hebrew or more of the Phoenician script of Hebrew, like the
Oh, yeah.
older
The
one.
ancient Canaanite script. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And then he also found, it was from the Byzantine era, hence the mosaics.
Hmm.
So 300 something. And then I think he found another monastery or well. So he kind of found things of three Abrahamic faiths just in the perimeter of Jericho.
Wow.
Um, yeah, and that actually, interestingly enough, that synagogue was actually the floor was protected by a Palestinian family until at some point, I want to say latest after Oslo, they that would be part of Area C, while the uh, Prophet Moses shrine would be part of in like little historic site becomes a dot of Area A amongst Area C. So it was just like how these swaps happened was also really crazy.
I think there was a biblical like basis to some of the swaps. I mean, like in Hebron, right? There's like a synagogue that they claim existed like for decades. I think it's like related to the prophet Abraham. And they're like, yeah, so we're gonna take this part of Hebron because Abraham has a connection there because they claim there was a synagogue. So we are running out of time, but we always like to ask our guests one final question, and that is based on the nation you're from, which would be Palestine. What is one thing you would like our listeners to take away about Palestine, whether that be advocacy, something historical? What is one thing you would like to leave them with?
I think that, you know, what I'll say about Palestine will probably be reflected in our neighbors as well. And it's that there are multiple histories and never just one.
mm,
And it's that when people think about Palestine, they mainly want to tie it to Israel's creation and Zionism, but this is just the current chapter of it. In the modern day,
Hmm.
where the borders are drawn, this is 1920s onward.
yeah.
Hmm.
But there's been many before. Even if Palestine was just a geographic region, and people say, "Oh, there was no such thing as Palestinians," then by that point, there's no such thing as Lebanese, Syrians, Jordanian. There's nobody then. There's no Ghanaians, Nigerians, Senegalese. None of them. None
Hmm.
of them, because some names don't always match areas either. But that doesn't take away people's roots of where they're from and where they feel connected to.
Yeah.
Cities
Absolutely.
are older than countries.
Hmm.
And you know, people contribute to building where they're from, be it infrastructure or crops.
Hmm.
Yeah.
You like people's roots or traditions are older than the idea of these borders
Yeah.
that we
And I
couldn't all control where they were.
and I like how you
S-
said
yeah,
it's not the first, only, or last. That goes,
Yeah.
and
Just a
and you
yeah,
also,
it's a
Elijah,
chapter.
like to say we're not others, we're brothers. Like inshallah,
yeah.
we'll see a world where the Levant is borderless and Jews, Muslims, Christians, everyone can unite under a single identity, like a civil state where, there's freedom of
But
movement and yeah.
you
Sorry, go
also hit on a very important concept in that historically, right? Predating these nationalisms, our identity was typically tied to localities before nations, right? And Haitham, I'm sure your ancestors before Palestinian, they would say, I'm from Tulkarem, then I'm Palestinian, right? Hayan, your family would say, I'm Damascus, but I'm Syrian, right? So, I mean, it's a very important concept that rootedness in the land doesn't have to take a nationalistic form. Very much so based on the locality, right?
Of
If you go
course.
from different Palestinian villages, if you look at the thobes, there's going to be different markings based on the village. I mean,
Mm,
this thing you see in the Levant and Palestine. So,
absolutely.
100%. Go back to your roots, and hopefully we can bond through that. Yeah.
And terms are have always been flexible because like before the 20s, what did Lebanon mean? It meant mainly Mount Lebanon, you
Yeah.
Yeah.
know?
Jabal
Even
Lebanon. Yeah.
Palestine was generally a geographic term for the southern Levant, not
Yeah.
Mm,
necessarily that dagger shape. It doesn't have to be. It could be
yeah.
half that size or double. But it's just like when people asked where in this wide land is it, it's like, oh yeah, this area with this term, with this
Exactly.
Yeah.
region.
I mean, it's really ludicrous because, like, if you have someone in southern Lebanon, how different are they going to be from someone from the northern part of the Galilee in Palestine, right? Probably very, very similar. But we just happen
Very
to draw a
similar.
border in a modern context. One's Lebanon now, one's Palestine. So, yeah, very recent innovation. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
You want to give some send-off words?
No, just a great note to end it off is always some uniting sentiment that I just always hope that inshallah we'll hold an episode in Jerusalem someday and having tea and petting cats and stuff like that, in a free Levant someday, inshallah.
100%
Inshallah.
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 I
Thank you
think you
so
did a
much, Haytham,
fantastic
for
episode.
coming.
Yeah. You've been
Thank you
amazing.
guys. Elijah, Hayan, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
You're
Appreciate it,
amazing,
man.
man.
Take care.
All right,
Ma
take it
salama.
easy.
Peace.
مع السلامة. الله معكم.